Hi, my name is Claire Murigande, and I believe that African women, particularly Black women, promoting inclusivity and leading their communities is dripping in Black.
Welcome to the Dripping in Black podcast, where we celebrate Black excellence throughout the Black diaspora. Our special guest host is Dominic Lawson from the Black is America podcast.
What's up, good people all across the world? This is the Dripping in Black podcast. I am your guest host, Dominic Lawson, multi-award-winning podcaster, and I serve as the director of podcasts for Owls Education Company. Just want to thank the man from behind the glass at Square again for this amazing opportunity. Now, before I go and continue, you see the fit, you know what we do. Get the merch, right? dibkdripshop.com if you want this type of merch and others, from mugs and other things, to kind of say, hey, I'm part of the Dripping in Black family. So make sure you go to dibkdripshop.com. But let me get to the task at hand. She is a multi-award nominated speaker, an exceptional moderator, and a leader who bridges science, leadership, and social impact. With a PhD in biology and executive MBA in digital leadership and a career rooted in thoughtful leadership, she has been recognized as an influential voice of change by the Female Factor in 2024. She is the host of Narratives of Purpose podcast, a show that shines a spotlight on changemakers across the globe, delving into crucial topics with youth empowerment, health equity, and the future of sustainable food systems. She is the one, the only, she's one of one, Dr. Claire Murigande. Dr. Murigande, how are you, ma'am?
I am doing great. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And as much as I like the sound of Dr. Murigande, you can call me Claire if it's easier for you.
Listen. We like to make sure we put out the honorifics when it comes to people who do good work. So since you gave that permission to me, now I'll just say Claire, because we just homies, right? We just homies. We just talking.
Exactly.
Like that. But no, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show, Claire. Please just kind of share with us a little bit about, who you are, what you do, and things of that nature, because we are fascinated to know more about you.
Who am I? That's a very, very big question. Well, as you mentioned before, so I podcast, I moderate events, I'm really working towards amplifying the voices of those who are really changing things in society. And my training background, if you will, is more on the scientific part. So I have a PhD in biology. So I studied for a very long time. I went all the way through the PhD. The reason for that is always because I'm so fascinating about learning so many different things that, for me, it's basically a continuous process. And I couldn't go further than the PhD, so at some point I had to decide to start working. But I'd say overall I'm more of a curious person, and I like to connect things and to connect people, and to also show how even in times of difficulty, actually we can all lean on each other and learn from each other. So in a nutshell, that's me. But I guess we'll be going into a bit more details throughout the conversation.
For sure. I want to ask you a follow-up based on something you said. You said you are a curious person, right? Because I think this world could use a lot more curious people as opposed to like judging and things of that nature. But I digress. Talk about how being a curious person has been beneficial, not just to your work and career rise, but also personal as well. Because I think that's important.
I think a few years back, I was a bit reflecting on like my career and the choices I've made, and I realized one thing is that although I'm not the type of person who regrets a lot, but I wish I would have learned very early on how to think critically, right? How to question things. And perhaps that me being curious was my way of going through that, right? Now with time, obviously, and going through what I'm doing right now and interviewing people, I guess I'm taking that road on thinking, okay, why are things like this? Why do we have to make things standardized, for example, when it doesn't match everyone, right? Why are structures this way when they don't include everybody? So these are all, critical thinking or critical way of looking at how we live as human beings on this earth. And curiosity for me was mostly about trying to understand and figure out how actually things work and how people work. I think I clearly remember, I can't tell you how old I was, maybe 6 or 7 years old, but there was this book. I don't know if it was in the library or at home, but it was basically like, I think a book for kids somehow, where they explain to you how the human body is constructed, like the different
Okay.
organs and all these things. And this has been something that always stayed in my memory. And I think that's why I've always fascinated by science, is to try to understand how did people figure out how, I don't know, a heart looks like and how it works, how it pumps blood and gives blood to all, the organs and your cells. And for me, that's where the curiosity comes from, is to try to understand, how is it that it's like this? How is it that a tree grows in this place, not in the other place? How is it that in winter they leave, they lose their leaves, rather in fall, autumn, For me, it's more like try to understand my environment. Curiosity was always about understanding my environment. And the way it has helped me is that I hope that I've managed to navigate through different environments pretty well, because I'm always open to try to understand. So I guess that's how it has served me so far.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you shared that, because, and especially connecting the curiosity piece to science, because I think for some reason, I don't know why it is, it feels like to a certain degree, science is kind of a bit under attack, right? We have people now who say, nope, the earth is flat. And we have people who say, pandemic wasn't real, and things of that nature. So as a scientist, right, like how do you engage? I don't want to say engage the world, but how, when you hear these comments and people saying things that have been proven for years, decades, maybe even hundreds of years, right? As a scientist, and you hear these comments, what does that, what does that do to you? Like, what does that make you think? What does that give? Does it, does it, it, do you feel like hopeless as far as like future goes or stuff like that? Just kind of talk about that a little bit.
I think I mostly wonder where it's coming from, right? I don't personally think that it's, although it looks like, science being under attack, I think for me, it's a matter of understanding, why are people thinking like this, or why are they saying what they're saying? And most of the time, it's not about the science itself. There's something else underneath, right? Whether it's beliefs, whatever, put anything you want in there. It can be religion. I have no idea. But the thing is, I mean, also as a scientist, I learned with time that to challenge also what I learned, because I learned through one lens, through the Western lens of looking at nature and everything and science, and how you learn things into silos, so to speak,
Right.
which I don't mean is wrong. It was a way of seeing things and establishing, structure. But we all know that, even if you look in the past, where science comes from, sometimes it has been used maliciously, if you can say like that, to explain other things which are not really rooted into the search of, of science itself. I don't know how I can define that better. And one thing that's really important, I've seen, come much more front and center recently, when you talk about climate change, for example. And obviously, from a Western perspective, and technology is being used a lot, there's many things we can do. But something that's really important is also rooting back into indigenous knowledge. And that is also science. It's just another way of seeing. And depending on where you are on this planet, then these different populations have developed their own scientific view. So I call it science today, because this is what the environment in which I grew up in. This is how we understand each other, you and me. But maybe if I was from a different population, from, I don't know, from some islands in the Pacific,
Right.
I wouldn't call it science, but basically it's about understanding how nature, how life in the end works, right? And how do I fit in that, or how do I work with that environment? So, to answer your question, I understand it is under attack, but I think for me personally, it has much more to do than science itself, but rather maybe some power play and some other things that people are maybe not happy about losing some privilege. And
Right.
so we can go into that I think it's a whole separate conversation.
Oh,
But I think it's
absolutely.
mostly important to understand, why are people talking about that? Why do they feel insecure because of, talking about COVID, and people they want to vaccinate? Why is that? maybe it's more than just the science. Maybe they have some, other mechanism behind that explains some other thing that needs to be solved, which is not the science itself. So it's a really, really interesting question, and I think it deserves really a deeper discussion.
For sure, and like to the part of the conversation you're talking about earlier, like it's one thing to be curious, right? Like science is based in asking questions and being curious, right? There's it feels like there's times now more than ever, and I imagine it's not new to our generation and our era, right? Like, but it's just one of those things where it's like now there are people, especially here in the States, I'm just going to be honest, here in the States, it seems like now those people are now making policy based on those doctrines, right? And that part is what kind of frightens me, I guess, a
Hmm.
little bit. And
Absolutely
speaking
right.
of, absolutely, and speaking of regime change and policy making and things of that nature, obviously we just had a new regime change and a transition of power here in the states, and that's gotten and when people are kind of thinking about, maybe the states ain't for me right now. Maybe I need to go move somewhere else. And so, dripping the black family, we haven't really discussed this, but Claire is coming to us from Switzerland as we have this conversation. I'm curious before we kind of move into our conversation about your work in the podcast and stuff like that, Narratives of Purpose. By the way, make sure you go and check that out on any of your major podcast platforms. Um, what is it like for a person of color in Switzerland and that navigation of just living and working and all those things?
I don't know if there's one answer to that. I
That's fine.
guess I
That's
guess it
fine.
all depends on your circumstances, your experience, and obviously how you got here. So for
Yeah.
me, I spend most of my life in Switzerland. So I like to say that I know my way around. So I
Enough.
don't like, there's a few barriers that I probably don't need to deal with, right? One of which being the language. I always talk about that. But so the country is split in different linguistic regions. So there's actually 4 official languages, but 3 major ones. And I speak 2 of them. And I've lived in the 2 geographic regions where these languages are predominant. So that's for me already one less barrier, I would say. And the fact of growing here, and I mean, I guess you could relate to that as well. You've lived in the US for a while. You kind of know how things work and how people think.
Right.
So you're not kind of faced with things that you don't know how to deal with, I would say. So on that end, I'm almost home here somehow.
Makes sense.
And the other thing is, because obviously I don't look, I look how I look. I think that's also something fascinating for people who kind of try to understand, like, how is it that you are here? And like, who are you basically? And the fact that like I said, I know my way around. I worked here, I studied here. So, I know what people are talking about. So I'm basically part of the environment.
Right.
I think it's always interesting because for me, I take that as a sort of a responsibility to basically, I don't like using the word educate, but at least to show different perspectives and to give maybe an input in a conversation or in a way to approach a situation that people might not have not thought of, because they don't have my experience or they don't have my references beyond Switzerland. Because I do have the references, but I also have other references,
Of
growing
course.
coming from East Africa and so on, and speaking a different language, speaking actually many languages even at home. So I think for me, I take it almost as a responsibility and a sort of a opportunity to be here and to contribute to opening up minds. That's how I see it. So, but obviously, like everywhere, if you're in the minority, so to speak, there are always things that you'll have to deal with, which are, sometimes I say it's because people don't know. It's a lack of knowledge and education. And it's up to you to to decide if this is important or not, if it's worth your resources. But these are
Right.
things you also learn with time as you grow older. So
Right. For sure. For sure. And speaking of places where um you were not the minority. I sat in on your panel at Afros and Audio. It was all African podcasting panel, which was phenomenal. I've shared personally some of the thoughts that I've had with you and what it meant to me to see that panel and discuss things. Kind of talk about, your experience on that panel and some of the things you kind of discussed for the Dripping Black family, Claire.
Yeah. That was absolutely amazing panel. And by the way, thank you so much for the feedback. And you're not the only one. I think we kind of planted a few seeds in the audience. And it was actually great to be also there representing the African continent, because since I've started podcasting, and the fact that I also do it in English, obviously, the US and the UK and any other English speaking region predominantly, that's where I also have most of my audience. And
Right.
being there representing the continent was actually very interesting, because that's when you realize you get together with people who have similar experiences, even though their environment is slightly different. So most of the people on the panel, actually all of them, I was the only one who's based in Europe, but all the others are in the US.
Right.
There is this thing of I felt like it was very strange, because I felt like being home away from home, and home in the sense with the people that have the same upbringing as you, but who have been obviously in different environment than the places where their culture is from. And that's, I think, something that connected all of us. And the fact that we were telling stories in different ways and from different angles was super interesting. And like I said before, also the way I moderate events and the fact that I'm interviewing people on the podcast, it was absolutely great for me to bring all these personalities together and try to, present a story in that moment in time and say, look, we are also here in the podcasting scene, and this is what we bring, and this is how it makes it even more enriching.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Like I said, it was a phenomenal panel. Definitely one that I found insightful for multiple reasons, for sure. But let's talk about your show, Narratives of Purpose. Just kind of talk about, why you wanted to start the show, what inspired you to amplify these change makers that you talked to. I listened to your latest show talking about investment in Africa in the oncology space and things of that nature. Kind of talk about why you wanted to do the show.
Well, I guess it pretty much ties into what I was saying before, in terms of me being here and having this responsibility, or at least this opportunity to
Yeah.
bring a new perspective to people. It's another form of doing that, which is much more tangible, right? Which is not only tied to certain situations, but actually I can put out something the way I see it, and most importantly, I can really amplify the work of people that I see are doing amazing things, but perhaps don't have that platform. Okay, they don't have this visibility, and I can contribute to that. So that was really the main thing. And the way it started was actually almost 5 years ago. So during the pandemic, so the summer of 2020, and I had this thing that I realized that, because it's sort of everything's wrong, everybody's at home, and you don't see people, it feels like it was only bad news, and we didn't know what was going to happen next. But in spite of that, things were still happening. People were still doing amazing things, but we didn't hear about those. I guess this is probably what news is all about. News is about things that are wrong, but sometimes news doesn't give you the solutions. So I thought, wait, we need to talk about solutions, because it's not only things that are wrong. In fact, if you probably look at it objectively speaking, there's probably more positive things happening than more negative things. It just depends, like, who is speaking the loudest, or who actually has a platform. So I thought, maybe, from my own small place in the middle of Switzerland, I can do something, because this podcasting, this medium, is so powerful. The audio medium in general, right? Aside with radio and so on, that you can reach anybody anywhere, and even in places where maybe infrastructures are not as developed perhaps in the US or even Switzerland, then lots of people have smartphones, and you can listen to these stories through those devices. So for me, it was almost a no-brainer. It's like, okay, no, I need to find a way to tell these stories and to bring these phenomenal people, to create a platform for them and to just show what they are doing. Because the other thing I realize is that for me personally, as an avid, podcast listener, I also know that there's also power into listening to someone's story. For when they tell their what they do firsthand. Because one thing would be like for me readings about someone and then telling to you about the story. But if I chat with this person and they use their own words, then you might relate much better than if I tell you, right? So if you know firsthand. So those are the two things. I want to show the positive aspect of things that are happening and also to relate to the listeners and say, okay, if this person who is based in Ghana, I guess that's the one you were talking about, the latest episode, was able to go from doing research and now building a company and raising money, okay, it's not impossible. If I have an idea and I can do it and I see that I can bring a solution, well, I can just tap into that and really get that motivation and that courage to start something, whatever it is, right? I mean, I spoke to people who might be maybe working at community level, some other are more global. But the thing is, it's all the same thing. You need to start somewhere and you don't know where it's going to lead you. So that's the whole background of the podcast.
For sure. No, I love that. And it was a phenomenal conversation, the episode that I listened to. And it made me think about, especially here in the States, and forgive me for being US centric, right? Because I'm a bit of a homer. So forgive me. I try my best to be a global citizen. But sometimes in the unit, when you live in the US and you have two big oceans on the side of you,
Yeah.
you feel you're kind of insular
Well, the US is
in that
almost a
regard.
continent, so I don't,
Right,
no need
right,
to ask for
right, right,
forgiveness.
right. But what I will say is that, like, I think sometimes growing up in the States, especially as a person of African descent, right, there's certain connotations and images and stuff like that that we see from Africa, and unfortunately they're kind of negative, if you will, right? And I think that conversation that you had with the gentleman, and forgive me, I can't remember his name at the moment. I definitely don't want to mispronounce his name for sure. But I think what that conversation highlighted was how there's a lot of investment going on in Africa. There's a lot of people doing leading technology that's coming out of Africa and Ghana and Kenya and all over the continent. How important is it you personally, Claire, for people to see Africa in that light, and not necessarily from the light of what we usually see here in the States of like having to give aid and things of that nature? Does that question
Mm,
make sense?
it does, yeah, and you're absolutely on point. That's the whole objective as well. Beyond because I spoke to people from all over the world, more or less. I mean, except for maybe Australia and South America, but I mean, I can talk to someone who is based in Switzerland doing similar work than someone who's based somewhere in Africa or somewhere, I don't know, in India, for example. And it's important because it just, as you said before, I mean, you need to show the reality because as much as the news wants to paint you war, starvation, whatever it is, not that it doesn't exist. Um, but again, it's not the majority of what people know, and it's not the reality of many people. I don't want to dismiss that because these are things
Of course
happening,
not.
but they're
No.
not only happening in Africa, by the way. So
Right. Right.
that's where it's. I guess it's
Listen,
it's very important just to bring the balance back.
no, for sure. Listen, I'm in the American South. I can go 20 miles in any direction, and it looks
Exactly.
like a very similar situation of people who are in need and need aid and things of that nature. But that's not projected out into the world,
Exactly.
the United States, right? So no, I'm on point with you there
Yeah,
for sure. But
yeah,
go ahead,
yeah,
you were
yeah.
talking. My
Yeah, no,
apologies.
no, absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. And that's the point. It's just to show that, it's sometimes you say, this expression of seeing the glass half full and half empty. You're looking at
Right.
the same thing, but you're looking from different angles. And the narrative, and I guess that's where it comes to the title of the podcast. It's about bringing those narratives which are very meaningful and changing that unique point of view you've always been fed and listened to, you know.
Correct.
And it's just so many things are happening. So many people are doing many things, and like you spoke about the panel. All these other podcasters who are also based in the United States, they're telling stories of Africans, of and in both ways, right? And also to show Africans how it is in the US, and that, as you were saying before, it's not all beautiful and gold on the streets everywhere.
No, it is
You need to
not.
hustle, and it's very difficult. The same
Right.
thing in Europe, there's always this like unique narrative of saying it's better. I don't mean to say it's not better, but depending what circumstances you arrive in here, it can be super, super difficult and like awful, right? And these are stories you don't tell about. And I think that's the power again of audio and the power of podcasting, and the fact that, you can have all these independent creators. You get to listen to all these versions of the story. You get to listen to all these stories, and you get to understand and have really like a comprehensive view of what the world is really. And it's no longer just one news network or two or three, and which are, as you were saying before, maybe politically oriented on this side or on the other side, and so on.
Right.
You get to really listen to authentic stories, and I think that's super important. And so the to come back to what you were saying before, my last guest, his name is Dr. Yao Bediako. So he's Ghanaian, and he studied in the UK, in the US, I believe, as well. And he did a lot of research. He was, lecturing at university, and now he started his biotech company, which is based in Ghana, and there's different hubs across the continent. And obviously, he is also coming from the perspective to say whatever we learn in school, like I was saying before. I mean, I didn't learn in school, at least at that time. I don't know if it has changed now. That African population is the most diverse in terms of genetics, right? And that in itself, as a scientist, should be like a core information to say, okay, if I want to develop these drugs or these therapies, and I want to cater to a maximum of people, then I need to consider also that population in my trials, in my research. And that's what he's doing, because so far it has not been done, which sounds like, oh, but why not? And I also had a few other guests as well who are based in South Africa. One is in South Africa, one is in the Switzerland, and they're both also within health and health tech, and how to advance all these basically how to have maximum population benefit from technology. And they have developed models that were really made for Africa, because obviously infrastructures are not always in place. You can't take a model from somewhere, for example, Switzerland, and just bring it in any country in Africa. And they have developed really models for the specific context that are now actually, at the time I spoke to them, I think it was a year ago, they were bringing those type of models to the US, to certain communities, because again, the access was so difficult to healthcare. But they have proven that this works, and this can be actually translated. So I really love that, the fact that there was this sort of south to north transfer that you don't really see. Again, coming back to your point, it's aid, it's we bring in, we do. No, but there is knowledge on the continent. There's knowledge everywhere, and we can actually be open to learn from that, because that's where some situations have been more difficult and more challenging, that probably the solutions are much more inclusive, even in the West.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, speaking of inclusivity, I know you're passionate about gender parity and inclusion. How do these themes weave into your podcast and the change makers you showcase, right? Because I think that you do a really good job of making sure that you have those conversations as well.
Exactly. So that's one thing. Well, I suppose it was a challenge in the beginning. And as they tell you when you create something, find your audience, have your niche.
Yeah.
And I was like, no, but I don't want to niche myself. Everything is important. We need to talk about everything.
Right.
So I went really like casting a broad net when I said, no, just go one. I said, okay, but I guess that's how I am. And, I walk through that anyway.
For sure.
And yes, again, like you were saying, inclusivity means, who are these people who are developing solutions to make sure that if you are part of a disabled group of population, for example, you still have access and your rights are recognized in the workplace, all these things. And it all makes sense, because if you look at, I had this analogy once. I was telling someone, for you as a human being, you can't live off of just drinking, I don't know, beer and just eating tomatoes, for example. you need to have a bit of everything. I mean, so basically, if it's out there, if it's in nature, it means that it has some use, right? It needs to
Right.
be considered. So if you as a human being, you exist, you are bringing something to the collective. And if you're not included in whether it's workplace, whether it's, healthcare, you don't have access, then for me, it's whoever is working towards finding that solution is important and needs to be on the podcast. So I'm more of a person who is more like, how do you say? I don't specialize really. I guess that's why I also had, different positions in my career. I didn't just,
Right.
I studied different therapy areas, not only one. I'm always fascinated by people who are specialists. For me, it feels like the most difficult thing to do because it doesn't come naturally.
Got you. For sure. No, I get that. I think there's times where you do need specialists, but I think there's also times where you need people who I like to say know a little bit about a lot of different things, right? And I think there's definitely value in that for sure. So I can appreciate that for sure. But in many of your different career paths and avenues and things of that nature, I imagine you've seen different styles of leadership, right? When it comes to people in charge or necessarily not in charge, right? Because I don't believe, leadership requires like a title or something like that, right? I guess I'm curious in your experience, what has been the best examples of leaders and leadership, like leaders who empower people who answer to them, or people who listen or something like that. I guess I'm curious, what have been those best examples you've seen and probably experienced when it comes to leadership?
Hmm, that's a great question.
I try
Um,
my best.
the best example, I guess, is probably also depending on the circumstance or the environment. But I would say inclusivity is something very important, but also being able to give a vision, having a vision, and being able to gather people around and follow that vision and give them the means to actually even develop their own contribution to that vision, right? So I don't think, in my experience, has that been embodied in one person? I'm not so sure, but I've probably seen that in different types of leaders or managers.
Gotcha.
And that's probably also what I have very much tried to do as a, how do you say, people manager or people leader at some point. And to be honest, sometimes it has been like going against what the how do you say, like the common assumption of saying, okay, you're in this, you're in a company or whatever, and you just have to perform, and they have this such and such time to perform, and you need to reach this point. So that actually is really a lot of constraints on how you want to achieve whatever you need to achieve. Doesn't mean it doesn't work. Maybe in some circumstances it works, but sometimes it doesn't. So I guess being a good leader is being able to adapt around the circumstances. And if you're a startup, are you funding a startup? Do you have like a company that's been around for a while and it's just about managing portfolio? So I guess someone who is able to, or people who are able to adapt on that, and especially understand who are the people making the team or making the company, and being able to see either potential or give them the space to bring what they can contribute. That for me would be excellent leadership.
I love that. I love that. Dr. Murigande, I want to say thank you so much for this conversation. We're definitely starting to wrap up here. And again, Dripping in Black family, if you want to check out the Narratives of Purpose podcast, make sure you have that in your podcast queue and all podcast platforms. It's a great show, phenomenal show. Definitely a lot of different perspectives and insight when it comes to many different things: entrepreneurship, education, academia, and all the things in between. Dr. Murigande, what's next for the Narratives of Purpose podcast? Are there's certain topics you want to discuss that you haven't been able to discuss so far? There's a certain guest that you're looking for. I'm curious about what's next for the podcast.
I think I have lots of ideas of guests and topics,
Fair
but what I
enough.
want to focus on, yeah, the thing is, I want to focus on something specific this year, is to is to develop like media partnerships with events and conferences. Because I think something that I've learned also with time, whether it's through the podcast or whatever, is working together brings much more or brings you further than doing things on your own. So, starting this, I was doing on my own, but then at some point I got a team, and things were growing. But I also realized that if I want to tap into some more broader, um, how can I say this, broader topics that gather even more people beyond like the podcast audience and maybe some of the organizations and structures I've been able to partner so far, I'd like to bring it to a different stage and really become a media partner, collaborate with events and conferences. And I have two things coming up this year. So in May, at the end of May, on the 23rd of May, there's an event happening in Geneva, and it's the third edition of this conference, which is the International Day I have to read. International Day Against Harassment and for Inclusion in the World of
Okay.
Work. So I was fortunate to moderate webinar last year, and this year I'm part of the organizing committee. And
Very
what I
nice.
want to do is to combine the people who will be on the webinars and create like a special series out of it through the podcast. So that's the whole idea, is to say, okay, there is this event or there is a conference which is gathering so many people. How can we bring like a complementary content to that? And obviously audio is my thing, so an audio platform that can
Right.
be also interesting for those guests who probably just had this audience who were present, but then with the fact that it's on the podcast and this medium, then they will have like a more lasting, if you will, presence from that conference. So this is happening in May. Another one I'm super excited about happening in June in Paris, 10 to 12th of June. It's the HIMSS, and that is the number one health tech conference in Europe. And I'll be moderating the women's health track, and my podcast will also be there at the exhibit floor to make sure that we can, capture as many trailblazers, pioneers, and leaders within health and health tech, and focusing specifically, again, coming back to inclusion and equity on closing the gender gap in healthcare, but also anything around access to healthcare or underrepresented populations. So those are two things really I'm excited about coming up, and I hope that whoever's listening not only tune into the podcast, but we're also looking for partners. So if you have brands, company, organization, and you're close to this one of these two topics in any way, and you want to support us or collaborate with us, just reach out.
Absolutely. No, that's some big time superstar status stuff there, Claire. Congratulations on all of that. One in Geneva and one in
In
Paris.
Paris.
That's amazing for sure, for sure. Um, uh, one last question I want to ask is, as somebody who amplifies change and change makers, for people listening to this podcast, the Dripping in Black family, what's one message or call to action you want to leave listeners with today? Right? Maybe just to be a little bit more curious, sir, as they, go on their journey. What's that call to action you want people to have as we kind of wrap up today?
I would say, keep questioning things that you feel don't add up or don't seem right to you. Just keep questioning and in an open mind, right? Something I learned also with time is, it can come from this frustration space where you're questioning, but from a negative, if you will, space where you're like, no, it shouldn't be like this because this and that, and these people are not. You're like, okay, why is it like this? How did it come to be? Because maybe you engage more into conversations where you open up people's minds. I think for me, it's like, keep questioning. If there's one thing that we shouldn't stop, because not only if we lead to conversations, but maybe it's also one of a good way to find solutions to whatever we're dealing with.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that. So here on Dripping in Black, we like to immortalize our guest a little bit here. And so when I ask this last question, S Square is going to cue something up for you to kind of share with you in order to do that. But my last question is this: when Claire Dr. Murigande, all the things, all of your parts, decides to, you know what, I'm ready to retire, and I'm ready to let the next generation take on this phenomenal work of highlighting change makers and leaders around the world and things of that nature. When you retire and they start talking about the legacy of Claire Murigande, what do you hope that they will say about you? Big question.
That's not a fair question.
I know.
What would people say about me? Gosh, I never thought of that.
Because you're doing some amazing work, right? And I think, we all live in, well, a lot of us, as we get older, we think about the past and things we've done and hopefully the impact we made. We start to think about what our legacy is. And so that's why I wanted to ask that question.
I would probably say that, I love people to remember me as someone who is constantly reinventing her path, her life, or the way she goes through life, and really not afraid of saying, okay, maybe I can start here and now, or maybe tomorrow is not given, so what do I have here and now to make the best out of it? And that having that mindset has actually enabled me to have people like you say that what I'm doing is phenomenal, right? So I think that's I like that.
Okay. Awesome. Well, it is phenomenal, right? And speaking of phenomenal, that's why we wanted to kind of share some with you. So when people come on the Dripping in Black family, we like to immortalize that time with our guest. And so S Square is going to pop something up on the screen for you there, just as a token of our appreciation of you coming on the show. So that is a magazine cover with
Wow.
you on there, just kind of highlighting what you do, what you're all about, and the phenomenal things that you're doing to make a difference and an impact in the world. So that is a magazine cover that S Square will send to you in the coming weeks and months and things of that nature, just to say thank you for so much for coming on the Dripping in Black podcast.
Oh, thank you. I'm the one to thank you. This is amazing. I love it. I love it.
Love it. Awesome. Awesome. So as we kind of wrap up, Claire, if you would just kind of remind the people once again where they can find you, where they can find the podcast and things of that nature.
Sure. So the podcast, the easiest way is to go directly on our website. So, I mean, it's a mouthful, but there's a short link to that. So you go on bit.ly, so bit.ly/narratives of purpose, all in one word. And there you land on the website. And if you can, subscribe to the newsletter is the best way to be informed of what's coming up. And as for me, social media, I'm actually more active on LinkedIn. So if you're on LinkedIn, you can find me, Claire, Claire, Murigande, Murigande.
Awesome sauce. Awesome sauce. Thank you so much, Dr. Claire Murigande, for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Please, again, thank you so much, Dripping Black family. Be sure to check out Narratives of Podcasts on all your major podcast platforms, but it's easier to find on the website, just like Claire said. Thank you, S Squared, for coming and letting me be a guest host again. More importantly, thank you, Dripping in Black family. And again, listen, got to get this merch, got to sell this merch out here, DIPKDripShop.com. Sorry, Claire, we're capitalists here over in America. You know how we do. Thank you, S Squared, for letting me come and do this for me. Thank you, Dripping in Black family. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting. And thank you for subscribing. And until next time, be kind, be excellent on purpose. It's a choice. And as always, keep it black. Peace.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that's it. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. You're right. You're really excellent at that.
On the next Dripping in Black podcast, we welcome actor, athlete, and author Otis D. Winston.
And last thing I would say, stutter is a metaphor. Everybody has a stutter in your life. Mine just started off physically. I had other stutters as I continue to grow. And whatever your stutter is, always remember this. Your stutter is not your stumbling block. It's your stepping stone. Your stutter should never make you stop. It's just a pause. It's a hesitation. And regroup, refocus, rethink, and keep going.
vibing with us. Keep the conversation going. Like, subscribe, and follow at DIBK20 on social media. Visit drippinginblack.com for all things Dripping in Black and dibkdripshop.com for your drip and other merch. Until next time, be well and much love.
You have just experienced a Dripping in Black production.